Good morning, America. Today I'm continuing my series focused on U.S. involvement in World War II. Today I'm going to continue talking about events in the Pacific in 1942 and after and subsequently after the fall of the Philippines. Alright, the Japanese conquest of the Philippines was a great blow to American strategy and morale in the Pacific. The United States Navy also had been beat up on rather badly at Pearl Harbor. However, as I mentioned before, the Japanese missed the aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor. They hit the battleships, they hit the airplanes parked at Hickam Field, they hit some of the smaller ships, but they missed the aircraft carriers because they were out at sea. The aircraft carriers are what allow America to stage a comeback in the spring and summer of 1942. America's functioning Pacific aircraft carriers allow America to pull off two victories against the Japanese in the spring and summer of 1942 that would prove crucial. The first of these was called the Doolittle Raid. The Doolittle Raid took place in the spring of 1942. What happened was this. The Americans have suffered a string of stinging defeats at the hands of the Japanese. The American Navy and Air Force have been beat up on at Pearl Harbor. Americans have been killed and captured at Bataan and Corregidor in the Philippines. Roosevelt and his generals need a quick, decisive win of some sort against the Japanese, both to hurt the Japanese and also to bolster American morale at home. And so they come up with the idea that they are going to see if they can do a bombing run over the Japanese homeland. Now, the problem is that airplanes during World War II have a limited range. There is no such thing yet as an airplane that can fly all the way across the Pacific and back again without stopping somewhere for fuel. So, the United States can't just launch airplanes from Hawaii, go fly bomb in Japan and come back again. It doesn't work that way in World War II. The airplanes don't have enough range. But an American Army Air Corps officer named Doolittle comes up with an idea. He says, why don't we fly bombers off of aircraft carriers? Now, that was a remarkable idea because it had never been done before. Big, heavy bombers don't fly off of aircraft carriers in World War II. The aircraft carriers are very small. Bombers need a big, long runway. At least so they thought. But Doolittle experimented. He found out that sure enough, lo and behold, you can actually fly a heavy bomber off of an aircraft carrier. Only one small problem though. You can't land again. So it's got to be a one-way trip. But they decided that they were going to do a one-time, one-way bombing mission over the Japanese homeland. Roosevelt gave the green light and it was a go. So they loaded specially modified heavy bombers onto aircraft carriers. They sailed as close to Japan as they dared, and then they took off from the aircraft carriers. Their plan was that they're going to take off from the aircraft carriers, fly over Japan, bomb Japan, then proceed onwards to China, and then land at air bases in China, which was also a member of the Allies, as you may recall, and for fuel. Well, unfortunately, the American fleet encountered a Japanese ship. They, of course, sank the ship, but they weren't sure whether the ship might have radioed a warning. So they had to go ahead and take off the planes now, even though they were farther away from Japan than they had planned. The bombers took off from the aircraft carriers. They arrived in the skies over Tokyo one fine morning, and no warning had been radioed. The Japanese were caught totally and completely by surprise. Out of nowhere, American bombers are sailing over their cities, dropping bombs on them. The Japanese are absolutely flabbergasted. They're so caught off guard. By the time they finally manage to get some planes in the air to oppose the Americans have already finished their bombing run and have flown off into the wild blue yonder. The Japanese can't figure out where in the world these planes came from. Now, unfortunately for the Americans, though, because they had to take off farther away from Japan than they realized, they no longer had enough fuel left to make it to a safe part of Japan. Most of them ran out of fuel over parts of Japan that were held by the Japanese. They had to bail out of their planes. They parachuted down in enemy territory, and unfortunately they were captured by the Japanese. And they were put on trial by the Japanese. They were, and most of them were ultimately held in prison in terrible conditions for the duration of the war. Only one bomber survived. One bomber, instead of going to Japan, they decided to go the other way. They flew north to the Soviet Union and managed to make it to Vladivostok and landed in Vladivostok in the Soviet Union, which was very surprising to the Soviets. So one bomber's crew survived by going to the Soviet Union, but the rest of them were captured by the Japanese. The Japanese could not figure out where in the world these planes had come from, and the American pilots refused to say, even under torture. The Japanese, when American reporters back home wanted to know the same thing, they asked President Roosevelt, "Mr. President, where did these planes come from?" Roosevelt chuckled and said, "Well, they must have come from Shangri-La." Now, Shangri-La is from a well-known novel and movie that was popular in America at that time that had come out just a few years earlier. It's from a novel called Lost Horizons and a movie by the same name. The novel was a bestseller and the movie was a hit in the United States. And Lost Horizons, Shangri-La, is a Buddhist monastery high in the Himalayan mountains where people live forever. It's a utopia. It's a no place. It doesn't actually exist. It's fictional. When Roosevelt said the planes came from Shangri-La, what he meant was, I'm not telling you where the planes came from. Don't ask any questions. The reporters got the hint, and when they wrote their articles about it, they repeated word for word Roosevelt's quote that the planes came from Shangri-La. Well, everybody knew that what Roosevelt meant was the planes came from no place. Don't ask questions I can't answer. The Japanese read those same newspapers, but the Japanese hadn't read Lost Horizons. They thought that the planes literally had come from Shangri-La, and that Shangri-La must be a code name for some secret airbase in China, someplace that they didn't know about. And so the Japanese were furiously determined to find and destroy Shangri-La, which they thought was a U.S. airbase. And so the Japanese launched a new offensive in China for the purpose of finding and destroying Shangri-La that resulted in many Japanese and Chinese casualties. So anyway, Doolittle raid didn't actually do that much damage in Japan, but was a morale boost for the United States and resulted in a new offensive in China when the Japanese were determined to find and destroy Shangri-La that didn't exist. Okay. Next, after Doolittle raid, comes the Battle of Midway. Alright, the Japanese were also determined to counterattack against the United States as well. And so they decided that they were going to take the island of Midway. Midway is a teeny tiny little fly speck of an island way out in the middle of nowhere. It's about midway between Hawaii and Japan, which is why it's called Midway. The Americans, though, knew that the Japanese were going to attack Midway because the Americans could read the Japanese codes. The American code-breaking program was called, well, there were two programs, Ultra and Purple. I know, who comes up with these code names, right? And those are not even the funniest code names from World War II. Ultra and Purple was the program to break Japanese codes, and they got pretty good at it. So when the Japanese said they were going to attack Midway, the Americans broke the codes and read it. Of course, they didn't actually say Midway, but the Americans figured out that it must be Midway through a sneaky way that I don't have time to explain. So anyway, the Japanese tried to fake us out. They pretended that they were going to attack Alaska. But the real attack was against Midway, and because of Ultra and Purple, we figured that out. So when the Japanese fleet shows up at Midway, lo and behold, the American fleet is there to meet them. The Battle of Midway was primarily an aircraft carrier battle. The Japanese are flying airplanes off of their carriers, the Americans are flying planes off of their carriers, and it's mostly a contest to see who can shoot down the most planes and shoot down the most aircraft carriers of the other side. The Americans won the plane shooting and aircraft carrier shooting contest. The United States won the Battle of Midway, which was the crucial turning point in the Pacific, because The Japanese lose multiple aircraft carriers and numerous trained and experienced pilots at Midway that they are not able to replace. So after Midway, the Japanese Navy and Air Force are never really the same again. Now, after the American victory at Midway, then the United States launches a more systematic strategy for the Pacific. Their new strategy is island hopping, which is they're going to hop from one island to another like hopscotch across the Pacific Ocean. Their goal is to get within striking distance of the Japanese home islands. The first island that they attack in the island hopping campaign is Guadalcanal. The Americans invade Guadalcanal in late summer of 1942, shortly after the Battle of Midway. The initial American landing on Guadalcanal is unopposed, but then the American Marines run into just an absolute buzzsaw of opposition from the Japanese defenders. The Japanese soldiers are committed to something called the Bushido Code, which is basically the warrior's code that says we always fight to the death. Death is preferable to dishonor. We never give up, we never surrender, we fight to the last man. The Americans don't get that. The Americans think that that's barbarian, and they hate the Japanese for it. But the Japanese are determined to fight to defend Guadalcanal and all these other islands to the last man. They will fight until they run out of ammunition. When they run out of ammunition, they will come at you with a knife, or with their bare hands if they have to. The Americans don't get that. The Americans wish that the Japanese would just surrender, but that never happens. The Japanese always fight to the last man. So there is fierce fighting on Guadalcanal, and the Japanese keep bringing in supplies. They managed to last a lot longer than anybody expected them to. The fighting in Guadalcanal lasts for about 6 months, from like August 42 until February 43, before the last Japanese are finally eliminated and the island is secured. The fighting is ferocious. There's many battles at Guadalcanal. Places like Bloody Ridge, where just tremendously fierce fighting. Even when the Japanese aren't fighting, they'll do things to try to annoy or psych the Americans out. Like the Japanese had one airplane. They've sent one airplane to fly in circles over the American encampment all night long just to keep them awake with the sound of the engine so that the Americans couldn't get a good night's sleep. And that's the type of thing that the Japanese will do on Guadalcanal. The Americans called that plane Washing Machine Charlie. Fierce fighting, but eventually Guadalcanal falls. After Guadalcanal, there's other islands. I don't have time to talk about them all. There's fierce fighting on Tarawa, which is a tiny little fly speck of a place. Fierce fighting. There's fierce fighting on Guam and the Marianas. And near the nearby islands, there's 3 islands right next to each other, Guam, Tinian, and Saipan. There's fierce fighting on all of them. Once the Americans finally take Guam, though, Guam is within heavy bomber range of Japan. So they repair the airfield on Guam and Tinian, and they start sending heavy bombers to hit Japan. And so then that was in late 44. So basically in the spring of 45, then you have routine heavy bombing by the American Air Force of Japanese cities. Japanese cities are leveled to the ground. Most of them are built out of wood. The Americans drop incendiary bombs, which cause fierce fires. The fires become so fierce that they have firestorms. These ferocious infernos that burn so hot that they actually create gale force winds, because the fire actually uses up all the oxygen in an area, which creates a vacuum. Air rushes in from outside to fill the vacuum, which creates gale force winds blowing into the heart of the flames. And then that picks up people and blows them into the fire. Now, the Japanese had done terrible things in China previously that I haven't had time to talk about. So the Japanese, at least the Japanese military, were not innocent. But the effects of the American bombing in Japan were pretty terrible as well. The final island battles. I also left off the Philippines. In the spring of 1945, the Americans fulfill General MacArthur's promise to return almost 3 years to the day after MacArthur was forced to escape in a small boat. MacArthur returns at the head of an army to the Philippines. The Philippines are liberated. There's a ferocious battle of Manila. Civilians are caught in the crossfire. Much of Manila is destroyed in the battle. But hey, they liberated it, right? Of course, it's in ruins, but it's liberated. So the United States liberated the Philippines, and MacArthur kept his promise to return. The final two battles were on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Iwo Jima is a small volcanic island with a mountain at one end of it, Mount Suribachi. There's the famous photograph of Marines raising the flag at the top of Mount Suribachi. And then there's a statue based off of the photograph in Washington, D.C. As usual, the Japanese on Iwo Jima fight to the last man. They retreat into caves dug into the rocks, and they have to be hunted out of the caves, which is very difficult and dangerous work. The last island to be taken is Okinawa, which is just off the coast, not far off the coast of Japan itself. So with the capture of Okinawa, finally, by the late spring of 1945, American forces are poised to take the Japanese home islands. Alright, that pretty much sums it up for the American campaign in the Pacific. And my next video, I'm going to talk about American involvement in North Africa and Europe. See you later.